Hello and welcome to the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center's Something to Talk About. These programs are sponsored by Fieldstone Communities Bainbridge Island. Fieldstone offers memory care and is constructing assisted and independent living, and they are now accepting residents. They also offer day stay and respite programs. Call 360-689-4314 to schedule a tour of Fieldstone's apartments on Rolling Bay today. We would also like to acknowledge that we are gathering on the ancestral homeland of the Suquamish people, the people of the clear salt water, who have lived on the water of the Salish Sea since time immemorial. We honor them and are grateful for their hospitality. I'm going to just hand it straight over to Anne Lovejoy now, who will also introduce Maggie.
Thank you, Mimi. I would love to welcome Housing Resource Board's Public Policy Specialist, Maggie Rich. Thank you so much for joining us, Maggie.
Of course, happy to be here.
Well, we're really happy you're here. I wonder if we could just start off with having you tell us a little bit about your job, what that involves, what being the Public Policy Specialist is about, and how you maybe envision developing that role a little bit with HRB.
Sure, happy to do that. So I'm Maggie Rich. I am HRB's Public Policy Specialist, indeed. I started that job at HRB a little over a year ago. Time has flown. A lot has happened and will continue to happen. This is a really exciting time for affordable housing policy. Before I talk a little bit about my role, I'm no stranger to political and external affairs on Bainbridge. So before I was at HRB, I was the external affairs manager at Islandwood. And I was born and raised here in Bremerton, and I'm a planning commissioner here in Bremerton too.
Cool.
So, yeah, my job at HRB, public policy specialist, sounds really cool.
Yes.
And what that really entails on a day-to-day basis is that I'm our connection to mostly municipal affairs. So I get to take the role of having to watch or attend municipal meetings, planning commission and city council, and other committee meetings off of Phaedra's plate. That's our executive director. That was her job before. And she needed someone to help with that. And then she also needed someone to help kind of strategize the results. So like what's going on at city council and what do we need to do about it in order to move affordable housing policy and change forward. So that's essentially my gig. I do a little bit also, so as a community land trust, HRB is a part of a Washington state cohort that does a little bit of work at the state level. So I'm also engaging with state policy during the legislative session, but the vast majority of our people investment is here, municipal politics, which is where a lot of the biggest and most profound change can happen for affordable housing.
Definitely.
Influenced by the state. So how'd I do, Anne? Did I miss anything?
No, I thought that was great. I read, and I think probably a number of our members also might have read your article on the Chamber of Commerce website about the city's recent adoption of the Housing Action Plan, informally called the HAP. I'm hearing a lot of people going on about the HAP. And I think a lot of us are curious about what the plan actually means and what it doesn't mean. And I got to say, I bet Phaedra is so glad you are on board to take over to that, because it's become more and more and more of part of the job to really pay attention to all this stuff on the municipal level that really is starting to move more about housing. But can you tell us a little bit more about what's involved with this Housing Action Plan?
I definitely can. So for those who don't know, whether you're here now or watching later, Housing Action Plan actually means something really specific. So cities in Washington can apply for state funding to develop a housing action plan. So that's through the State Department of Commerce, which means there are pretty rigid rules about how to undertake the development and adoption of a housing action plan. So Bainbridge applied and was awarded that funding. They really got going on it early last year. And in a moment, I forgot to put my cat, so sorry, in the other room. So you're about to see my cat enter the frame, but we're just gonna keep rolling. So cities that are awarded that funding have to undertake first housing needs assessment. So if you have, oh my goodness, engaged at all with the housing action plan at any point, you most likely were given the opportunity to provide feedback through the housing needs assessment. So that took upwards of 6 months.
Yeah.
And they hired contractors whose specialty it is to get community feedback about the state of housing, and then also look at hard data like census data and HUD data. Oh my goodness. This is Huckleberry, who you're seeing occasionally enter the frame.
Huckleberry is very welcome to join us.
Huckleberry, like Huckleberry Hound. Okay, so he is a big kitty cat. So after the housing needs assessment was accomplished beginning of this year, and if maybe after I just kind of talk about what the housing action plan is and next steps, I can talk if people are curious about how HRB, what our perception of that housing needs assessment process was like.
Definitely, thank you.
Yeah, but moving forward, so after the housing needs assessment was accomplished, then their policy team, so this is not only city staff at this point, they're contracting with others to help them undertake the housing action plan in concert with planning staff, COBE staff members, undertook creating the housing action plan itself. So the housing action plan, I actually wrote it down just so I wouldn't misspeak, essentially captures 9 overarching housing strategies with 30 specific sub-actions. If any of you are familiar with the Affordable Housing Task Force that undertook this effort in 2018.
I was on that task force, yeah. And so was Ed.
Okay, well, thank you both for your work. And if either of you have looked at the Housing Action Plan, you'll notice that much of what was captured in that 2018 report is again repeated in this Housing Action Plan. So from our perspective, none of the strategies were shocking. They're like meant to lay out and make it very clear to municipal governments the tools available to them to make it easier to build affordable housing, to minimize displacement, to maximize subsidy, and beyond. So none of it was surprising, but certainly still monumental when the city unanimously adopted this housing action plan in June. I don't say this to be sort of facetious, but it is kind of shocking when city councils do anything unanimously. The little tongue in cheek, but truly we were like, oh, thank goodness that everyone feels good about this housing action plan. But what I can say is that we were apprehensive about the implementation of the housing action plan, because I'm sure many on this call, certainly those who participated in that task force, didn't want to see, like a big, shiny, great, well put together plan created and then shelved. Nothing is more frustrating than that. So fortunately, and HRB can take a humble amount of credit for this alongside others, when the housing action plan, before it was adopted, when it was snaking its way through Planning Commission, because that's where its first stop was, Planning Commission came up with 3 additional procedures upon adoption that include a biannual scorecard. So that means that staff are required to report back on progress in the implementation of the housing action plan. And then the other 2 directives are pretty wordy, but essentially amount to the creation of memos. So that would be public documents explicitly showing how implementation can be undertaken in the Winslow Sub-Area Plan, which is happening right now.
Right.
I circle back to, and then the comp plan update that will be in 2024.
Right.
So essentially what that means is, that means the city has to show, here are all the actions and here's the ones that we can actually get going on in current process it's undergoing right now, which, I mean, I'm a talker with my hands, but especially when I'm excited or feeling accomplished. So you can tell that felt like a big accomplishment. So Planning Commission sent that along to council. So upon adoption at council, they actually included those 3 directives. So for people following along in the future, that will mean you can expect the city to have to deliver on some sort of scorecard, which is open to interpretation, but essentially means like, how are we doing on implementation of this plan? And even probably what will come first is the Winslow sub-area plan. I've just taken a look at their upcoming agenda items, and one is the Housing Action Plan implementation memo, which is it feels big.
Which is amazing, because that would mean some real accountability.
It could, yeah.
It's been a real missing piece so far.
So what do you think about that answer, Anne? And what did I miss, or what do you think?
I think you're very accomplished, Maggie.
Oh,
you're really good at this, because that kind of stuff is hard to hold it all, and it's complicated, and to be able to encapsulate it like that is great. I think one of the pieces I'm really eager to hear about is how that accountability might play out. And of course, nobody really knows yet. But I think the fact that there are several steps involved so far, and that it looks like a bit of a checks and balances, like if nobody's doing X, then we're going to hear about it by this other piece, right? That's a really encouraging step forward, I think. And I know that our present city manager is definitely very dedicated to affordable housing. And I think the council's unanimous vote shows that we have a pretty strong forward momentum here, which is great. But yeah, I think one piece I was curious about is, like, you mentioned how specific this housing action plan is because of the, I guess you'd say, the governmental regulations that encompass it. But can you, like, what maybe will not happen that people think will? Like, are there parts of, I know that it doesn't mean some of the things some people have thought it did, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing that we encountered, because my colleague Tamar at HRB, who manages and is very brilliant at communication, encountered a lot in trying to temper expectations for what the adoption of the Housing Action Plan meant. So one thing that we heard often was the assumption that all of those, 30 actions under those 9 strategies would happen. And that's the adoption of the Housing Action Plan is like a proof of purchase, like we received the Housing Action Plan, it meets the requirements. We can tell and communicate to the State Department of Commerce that we used the money correctly and that it meets their requirements for a housing action plan. But just that simple adoption itself doesn't mean that those specific actions will be undertaken. That's where that accountability, those checks and balances, that's why we were so relieved and happy when those were adopted. And then certainly the work of advocates and others who are engaged will be to continue to pay attention and specifically with those checks and balances. So in answer to your question, one of the things we heard often is, so are all of these going to happen? Right. It's like, well, hopefully many of them will, and certainly with careful consideration and proper governance here locally as they undertake them. I also think that one myth we heard often in the context of the Housing Action Plan was, I think that there's so much engagement just as residents with things that in other communities are less talked about, like a city's comprehensive plan. And lots of concern over the comprehensive plan, which will be updated in 2024, which is a great place for these conversations. But just adopting the Housing Action Plan itself does not automatically make changes to the comprehensive plan, for example, or to the Winslow sub-area plan. So it's like directives, but they still got to do something.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think we all have felt that the city is very well intentioned, but kind of overburdened to a certain extent. And so I, for one, have been a little concerned about how stretched they are. And so who is going to do this? Do you have any sense of that, of like, will there be a dedicated staff person, half-time staff person? You mentioned I know there are outside consultants as well, but how who's going to track this and who's going to kind of give, because you got to have an engine. You have to have a push to keep this kind of thing really going. And I'm curious about where you see that might maybe happening.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I have two different answers. When the Planning Commission and City Council both clearly indicated that they did want these checks and balances, Patty Charnas, who's the planning director, so she's the boss of the planning department, she did express totally justifiable concern that those checks and balances are something that they could actually accomplish. So it's a big deal when council directs staff to do something. If they need to be able to do it. And if they can't, they need to, there's maximum transparency, or at least that's the goal with local government, to just to clarify why they can't accomplish those things, not just because they didn't want to, but they have to say, we understand you've directed us to do this, and here's kind of our capacity. So I think the compromise when that did come before council was to ensure that the directives were clear in their intent. So we want transparency and we want accountability, with the understanding that planning staff directed by Patty Charnas are going to be operating under multiple constraints of things that they're undertaking right now. So I think it's fair to say that, for example, the scorecard, we will get something and it won't look like, the huge housing action plan where consultants were paid by Commerce and dedicated all of their time only to that. It will look more like, for those of you who look at city agenda packets, it'll look more like simple memos, like things that are actually already kind of in the engine of the way they do things. My additional answer is that, so HRB had a meeting with some city staff and city council members last week to just kind of update on projects and other questions that we had. And so the city has hired someone new who works under the city manager. So she works in executive administration to only focus on the management of affordable housing.
Now, is that Laura Shear?
That's Laura Shear, yes. So I think that her job could take many directions, and I don't work for Kobe, so I can't totally say internally how she's being directed. But I can say that when we connected, she was like, yes, it's my job to get up to speed on affordable housing and help track and manage affordable housing directives within the city. So I think that she'll probably play a factor of capacity building here as things ramp up, both with undertaking new policy, just last week, they introduced a new policy that could reduce land use permitting fees for affordable housing developments.
Right.
And also, she's the person who I think is going to help manage, if the city, those of you who watched the council meeting last week might have also seen in Blair's executive report, Blair King is the city manager, that the city does plan to go about the process of developing their own affordable housing. And I think Laura is also going to be managing part of that. So that was a little bit of a windy way to say, I think they're trying their best to do some capacity building with limited funding and staff.
Yeah, and having Laura on board is really definitely a step forward, because in the past, when the last time we were doing the Affordable Housing Task Force, and Ed Kushner, as I said, and I were both on that, there was supposed to be a half-time staff person, but it was sort of like a 10th time staff person, because they already have so much on their plates. And that it's a lot to ask. And yeah, it's not even possible, really. So this sounds really more positive than the last time we cycled through this. So I wondered if you think that the adoption of the HAP is going to encourage some better housing solutions, and if so, how might that work? Just right away, or are we going to start seeing people picking up on this and saying, oh, okay, if you're going to set this up, then this will work and this will work that didn't work before, or whatever? Do you see anything like that on the horizon? Or
that's a great question. For those of you who've looked at or might tune into the Housing Action Plan like the actual document, the consultants were pretty careful to indicate which actions were going to be quick wins, like things they could undertake right away, maybe because they already have a funding mechanism in place or the policy already exists. They just need to make a minor update. It won't involve a long range planning process. And, you know, if you'd asked me a couple weeks ago, like, do you think things will happen right away? I don't know how I would have answered. This week, seeing how quickly they want to move on the fee reduction ordinance. So that's actually one of the actions, one of the 30 actions in the housing action plan, essentially subsidize permitting fees for affordable housing developments. And for those who don't know, permitting fees are really expensive. They're a huge part of any development's budget, and certainly an affordable housing development's budget. And for organizations like HRB, when our developments are 100% affordable, which won't always be true, there has been, and will in the future be developments that are mixed, that are not 100% affordable. It's not a threshold that every developer can meet, but it is our threshold. Reducing those fees is really, really critical. And I think we were unsure that if the city would take on subsidizing that themselves. So that is a sign of significant progress for me in terms of they introduced it, they talked about it, and they're likely going to pass something this fall. So I do think that's a sign that they might undertake some of those quick wins pretty quickly. I think that some of the bigger questions that I've heard residents have when it comes to local housing policy and maybe some of those things you see in the housing action plan that are more long range, like make improvements to our multifamily tax exemption credit policy, MFTE, or, you know, consider bonding in order to fund affordable housing. Those just by nature are going to take longer, but I think people feel very anxious about them because we know that some of those can have some of the biggest impacts in terms of what we see, like the actual buildings that could possibly go up. Especially in the context of, this is another local policy thing, so please stop me if I use acronyms that are too funky, but so we have a county planning body, and then we also have kind of a region planning body. And that regional planning body sets essentially the numbers that the county and then the city that participate in that planning body are expected to absorb over periods of 20 or 50 years, depending on the planning being undertaken. And new numbers were just adopted in June to accommodate a state law that passed 2 years ago that essentially requires municipalities to not just plan for a specific number of people and therefore units, but that they have to plan those units across income bands. So right. They can't just say, I'm gonna make up a number just to make it very simple. This is not the number for Bainbridge Island. The number for Bainbridge Island is something that I will not get incorrect. I need to look at my paper. So, but while I'm looking at Zoom, I'll make up a number. So let's say a city has to plan for 50 units. That would be very small. They can't just say, well, we've made our planning policy such that 50 units could be built over this period of time. They have to make planning policies such that 20 of them could serve 40% and below. Another 10 on top of that could serve 80% and below, and then 80 to 120, and then the rest, which is usually the smallest number, at our highest incomes. That might not have been a great illustration, but essentially it requires cities to plan for affordability in a way that Washington has never regulated before.
Exactly. And that was pretty groundbreaking, wasn't it? I mean, that made a big difference to a lot of communities, I think.
I think it did and will, and I think it requires cities to be thoughtful and creative. So those numbers are, you know, that's not a theoretical exercise. Those numbers came down from that planning body, and, you know, it's across a very specific table. It says how many units need to be planned for across specific income bands, which I want to make sure for those of you watching now and later, the way that planning works is that it's not as though they're drawing up precise blueprints exactly where those units will go. They have to essentially show that their planning policies, what they are allowing to be built, can accommodate those numbers over a certain period of time. And because now a certain percentage of those are thoughtfully required to be affordable, that requires them to be very specific in their planning policies when it comes to affordability.
Yeah, and that's going to make some pretty big differences. I'm just curious whether, well, I don't know if you know this, like if local developers are really happy about this or not too sure what it means yet, or if you're getting a lot of questions about where are we supposed to be going with this? I don't know about you, but the city probably, right? I mean, HR too, to some extent.
Yeah, I definitely think the city is. I think that other stakeholders who are just in a lot of meetings with developers, whether those people are architects or consultants or the other brain trusts that are frequently at those tables, I think have a lot of questions about how those numbers are going to be accommodated and how the city is going to not just make it easier for developers to say undertake a certain portion of their development as affordable, but to make it, you know, the reason I'm being careful is because I'm not a developer, and I am trying to be very careful about the way that I kind of talk about the way developers talk and the nature of their business. You'll hear them say often that their work has to pencil. I don't know how many men in rooms where people will say like our work has to pencil out. And at the end of the day, when they say that, they mean, you know, they're investing a certain amount of money and they need to be able to make their money back. And a lot of developers, as it stands, will say that, you know, it just doesn't pencil to include affordable units without additional subsidy or tax breaks. So that's what cities have to look at.
We've heard that a lot. And, you know, one piece I think about is that in view of all this stuff we've been talking about, but we citizens have a role in this too. And part of that engine driving put this forward is us. Like, so I think the fact that Bainbridge is on the whole really pretty much in favor, at least on paper, and you know, verbally, everybody's in favor of affordable housing and better housing options. So how can we, what will help us stay engaged and hold our elected officials accountable for continuing to advance this effort? I mean, there's always been a lot of pro-housing talk, but not a ton of action. And in fact, there's been pushback, the NIMBY thing, where it's like, oh, I totally want to see affordable housing on Bainbridge, but not where I am, because that would be inconvenient or whatever. I mean, people have some pretty strange ideas about what affordable housing is and who it's for. When I remember talking to a number of people about being on the list for Ferncliff Village back in the day, and I'd have people saying, oh my God, aren't you afraid they'll strip your car? And I was like, who do you think lives there? It's like firefighters and school teachers and, you know, retail people and or teachers. It's me, you know, I'm going to strip your car. Besides, my car's so old, nobody would strip it for anything. But that's not the point. It's this really fascinating, like, I'm all in favor of it, but, and it's an us them kind of thing. So part of it, to me, I really wanted to see public meetings talking about what is this affordability scale and who fits where, not necessarily name, but like, like teachers are going to be fit in this category, you know, given the regular, this is what salaries are on the island, this is where our firefighters are going to be, and why 60% of our first responders don't live on the island. Well, look at these numbers, because that makes it real to people in a way that I think it's when it's just a theory, they don't really have the same kind of feeling for it, right?
Right on.
But one thing I've tried to get the city to do this, and I feel like it might be a step too far, but maybe that's something HRB and the Senior Center could do together. Like we could put together some of these conversation opportunities and have some speakers or a panel and help it get real. Because it's like so many things, people who find any group different. As soon as you meet people and start talking to people, and it's like, oh, well, that's just, Jim and Joey, right? Or whatever, it starts to be really different. And I think putting faces on some of these other categories might be really helpful for getting not just public opinion, but public action.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. Go ahead, Anne. I don't want to interrupt you.
No, you have to.
No, I feel the same way. You have to interrupt me. Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. I have so many thoughts, but to make them helpful to this kind of call. Although, Anne, it sounds like you and I could probably get along like a house on fire and talk all day about this. But I think that what you say is so true. And we hear that all the time, often when people maybe are more new to getting engaged or getting involved, maybe they're doing so because of our advocacy alerts at HRB, and they're like maybe sending an email or showing up and speaking in favor of some policy, that I do think that there's a certain amount of myth around like who is in favor and who isn't in favor. And, that plays out over and over again in communities all over the country. I'm not going to spend time on a separate segment about like divisiveness in democracy right now, because that could be its own call. And I think when you work in community organizing or advocacy, one of the things that becomes really important is acknowledging that, like, you kind of start out with really strong supporters who are on your side. Those people are engaged. They participate in at affordable housing task forces like you and Ed. And then there are people who are also very, very, very engaged, but they're on the other side of the bell curve, and they're, organizing themselves, or they're participating in anti-growth organizing. But then there's like a lot of people in between who just want to understand better. And the vast majority of the time will favor policy that supports their neighbors. And that one of the things that's so that we've tried to kind of start chipping away at this year is that, and my colleague Tamar gets all the credit for this, but acknowledging that HRB is like really take our trust really seriously. I think that people trust us to explain things well and factually, and that, we're a bit of a civic convener, like that we can help people understand things that otherwise can be like needlessly confusing, which is not unique to Bainbridge. That's true for like any local government. Like it can be tough for people, it's not their job, or they don't have time, or they just don't understand. So I think that I might be kind of going down a different road here, but what you said, Anne, is so true. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation and fear around, particularly on the subject of housing growth and change. It's really hard for anybody, and really easy to tap into people's anxieties and fears about the future, and to provide a place for people to kind of have their fear, but then stay connected to reality. So a good example of this one is those KRCC numbers. So those, when I was using that acronym earlier, that's that regional planning body. And not everybody paid attention to this, but when people just hear the number, like, where are we going to put 1,100 units? That's way too many people. Like, that's going to change everything about everything I know and love about Bainbridge Island. And organization like HRB can be a part of like contextualizing like what that really looks like over time and what's really asked of that, and kind of what, I think could be really exciting. And a part of storytelling, like you're talking about, Anne, is really encouraging people to be a part of the conversations about what we want the future to look like, because we get to be a part of that. That's like community engagement is not just a bonus of local government, it's a requirement.
Exactly.
They have to do that. They're responsible for hearing from their community. And the more people feel connected to their local democracy and a part of it, sometimes that can help reduce fear and anxiety about what the future could look like when they're just given a chance to speak up. So in HRB, that can look like, signing up for our advocacy alert and participating in events as we do them in the future.
Well, stop right there and say a little more about your advocacy alert, because maybe not everybody knows about that.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So HRB, you can sign up for our advocacy alerts on our website. So if you went to our website, there's a big tab at the top that says advocacy. You can hover over it and click, and then there'll be a hyperlink or a link to click on to sign up for our advocacy alerts, and it'll ask you to put in your email and your information. We always, if Tamar was here, she would want me to promise, like, we don't spam you, and it's not a secret way to put you on any of our lists other than advocacy. So if you do that, that means you're signing up to receive emails from us whenever there's opportunity to engage specifically about policy that calls for people to show up or to express their support. So oftentimes those advocacy alerts look like updating you on the issue, offering some messaging. So what it is that HRB, they're voting on this tonight. If you support this, send them a letter and let them know, because they want to hear from you. We've built out a little bit on our website for people who, I imagine that some of the people on this call are familiar, but maybe not all. Maybe you've never written a letter to City Council and, feel like it has to be perfect or even spoken in front of City Council. I worked at Islandwood. I worked at Planned Parenthood with teenagers, and I helped run our advocacy and lobby events with teens. And I bring this up because when teens would be getting ready to go into their meetings with their state legislators or their local legislators, frequently very, very anxious about getting it exactly right. Like, if I don't say the right thing, this thing that's really important to me, this policy, maybe won't happen. And my advice to them extends well into adulthood, because I think that it's also true that adults of any age can be anxious about that same thing, is that just saying something is better than saying nothing. So certainly our advocacy alerts can help you feel like you have all the facts, but at the end of the day, for me, what's most important is that if you have something to say about housing and you think this policy is a good idea, or a policy is a good idea, that you just email your city council members and let them know that you think it's a good idea. There's no expectation that you yourself be a policy expert.
No, that's a really good point. And I think you're right that people are like, well, I don't know what to say. And all you have to say is, I love the idea of, or I'm really worried about the idea of whatever that might be. Because you're right, like, everybody's theoretically, they are all responsible to us to serve what we want. But if they don't know what we want, how can they do it, right? So speaking up is really part of, I think, your civic duty, right? Making sure. I happen to live practically next door to City Hall, and my kids tease me that it's so that I can go and interfere more. But, I live in the mobile home park right behind City Hall. A lot of people don't know that Bainbridge has a really sweet 50-unit mobile home park, but we do. It's one of those affordable neighborhoods, right? And I love the idea that there could be little cluster neighborhoods like this, which is practically unknown, all over the place, and people would hardly know they were there, but they would be full of life and people of many different backgrounds and orientations. And I just love that. Diversity is great, right? On Bainbridge, one of the things that I always think is so interesting is that we have incredible diversity on the weekends, because people come over in hordes from Seattle, and you'll hear a dozen languages and see all kinds of fascinating clothing and hear, wonderful families touring around. But on the weekdays, it's really not that way. And I'd love to see more diversity of all kinds here. But again, if people want to see that, we have to make that obvious, right? We have to be welcoming, and we have to have, place at the table for people who maybe aren't being served right now. I'd love to see a little more of that. And that's another thing we can let our elected officials know, but certainly starting with City Council, is the great place for most people to, and you don't have to go to the meetings. You can send an email, if you go on the website, it's really easy to do that. I can write a letter to the paper, especially if it's contentious, always better, right? But I guess also I'd love to hear, like, if you maybe give us an update on housing projects that HRB is working on now or advocating for. Because I think I've had a lot of people say, well, what's going on with, Wintergreen? What's going on with 550 or Erickson? What are some timelines? What's next for some of these places?
Mm-hmm. I will do my best in Phaedra's stead. And just to make sure I got it right, I wrote it up.
Oh, well done, you.
Just because I know, especially with Wintergreen and Erickson, there's a lot of like, what's happening? Okay, so pardon my stiffer reading, but I will read just to make sure I get it right. So Erickson, so I'm about to tell you about current HRB projects. So these are builds happening right now and in the near future. So Erickson is a 100% affordable multifamily rental project on land that was sold to HRB at a very discounted rate by a generous donor.
Very generous donor.
Very generous. The project will have 18 units in the building. 12 are 1 bedroom, 6 are 2 bedroom, and 2 of the units will be specifically for people with disabilities. And that project, should all go according to plan, will be complete in 2025. So groundbreaking is going to happen here pretty soon, towards the end of this year.
That's really exciting.
Yes. I'm not our development director, so her name is Sophia Blamey. She's also great. Undertakes all of our fundraising and development efforts. But, I think that if Phaedra were here, she would make it clear that we're still actively fundraising for Erickson. So we have a little bit of budgeting that we're needing to make sure is covered as we undertake the huge lift of getting that ground broken. We did receive ARPA. So that was that temporary federal funding. It came through cities. Some of that went to Erickson. So if you were ever deep in the bowels of City of Bainbridge documents and you ever see the affordable housing fund, what funds are dedicated to affordable housing, you'll see a temporary several million bump this year and next, but that's not typical. And that was because of that federal funding for Erickson and others. They have a little bit left actually that is yet to be claimed. So that's Erickson. So Wintergreen Townhomes is a community of, sorry, I had a little bit of brain glitch there. It's a community of 73 homes. 31 are designated affordable. So 31 are in our land trust. I didn't say earlier, for those of you who don't know what a land trust is.
Good.
Yeah, we're the only land trust in Kitsap County. And we're different than a housing authority or other nonprofits, but we are a 501c3 in that a community land trust actually means something really specific. So essentially, community land trusts are what they sound like. We own the land under an apartment building or under homes. And in the event of a homeowner owns the improvement, which is what Phaedra always says. So that means the house. And then there's a ground lease that uses a lot of really cool jargon to ensure affordability in perpetuity. Mm-hmm. So in the event of home ownership, if that home is in a CLT, like Wintergreen Townhomes will be, and like our other 44 units of home ownership in our community land trust, when the homeowner goes to sell, they have to sell based on a specific formula set in stone by that lease, requiring affordability. So homeowners make a small amount of equity, but the house remains affordable in perpetuity. And HRB is a steward of the land. So Phaedra always says it's like we've removed this. We are not a part of the speculative market. We're just off the market. We're off the market and we operate differently in order to ensure affordability. And then same, our rental units, those are heavily subsidized by other funders. So we raise money, and then federal institutions like HUD are the ones who help subsidize those rental units so that we can keep them affordable. And then they're also the ones that therefore, when you get that funding, it's certain requirements follow, like who can live in those units. That's how those are guaranteed to people of certain incomes.
And I know there's different baskets for different, so I remember Phaedra sort of said, well, when she looks at who's going to qualify for this house or that house, it's like, oh, good, this person will fill that niche. Because sometimes you know, you have to find a very specific match for the loan subsidy and the person who's going to be moving in, which I think is actually really cool, because that again is another piece of diversity, sort of hidden diversity, that really helps us have a richer community in a lot of important ways.
Absolutely. We, our property manager, her name is Jessie. It's a really hard job. She's the person interfacing with all kinds of people, all different kinds of backgrounds, who are arriving with a unified need of affordable housing. But then it's Jessie's job to do the chess pieces of ensuring that they can qualify, you know, for this housing, because we can qualify for the funding. Oftentimes we're seeking out additional subsidy just to ensure that people can stay and that there's a lack of displacement. But I'm getting off topic. We're talking about Wintergreen. Wintergreen townhomes will be a community of 73 homes. So 31 are in our land trust and will be affordable in perpetuity. I should have said earlier, when I say in perpetuity, I really mean it. That's what's cool about community land trusts. Oftentimes, local affordable policy might have an expiration. So sometimes affordable units are built, and then after 50 years, they're no longer required to be affordable. Not so with community land trusts. So our homeownership team they are busy bees. They are super hard at work helping. I wish I had the number on the top of my head, but you know, they're getting ready to sell these Wintergreen townhomes so that people can move in. And that work of getting people's loan packages ready and helping people as much as possible is really hard work. And it takes 2 staff members. HRB only has a staff of 11 and 2 are dedicated to our homeownership program, just to ensure that people are set up for success with their loan packages. Okay, but Wyatt and Madison, our third project, will be an 80-unit mixed income residential community in downtown Winslow. We're acquiring 13 rental units from Madison Avenue Development. It's the developer, and it will encompass 550 Madison Avenue's property, which was formerly owned by Housing Kitsap, no longer, and replaces 13 affordable units that once occupied that site. So there used to be 13 affordable units there. This development will happen, and we will be acquiring those 13 rental units and then secure them in our land trust. And I am unsure. I wish that Phaedra was here so I could tap her and she could give the kind of official timeline update on Wyatt and Madison. But I know that's less, I can tell you for certain that Erickson is on a specific timeline. I think Wyatt and Madison is less of a specific timeline, though, in the near future.
But it looks like Wintergreen's getting really close.
It is, yes.
So that's pretty exciting. Well, I'm wondering if anyone else, Jake or Ed and Karen or Sheila, if anybody has a question that I haven't brought up, is there anything you've been thinking about?
Well, I do have something that I think is really critical. You have to have the land to build on. And if you don't have the land and the infrastructure like sewers and water system, you have all kinds of things that would be good, but you can't do them. Expanding the sewer system on Bainbridge Island is not easy, not from a political point of view or from a geographic one. For example, I know that at an earlier point in time, those of us in the Bainbridge, Bethany congregation checked into getting the sewer line from Weaver onto the church property. Sure, it can be done, $1 million. Well, where's that going to come from? So that's a key thing, is the availability of land. All those other things are wonderful and also necessary, but if you have no place to do it, why don't we make, for instance, and I know there's some conversation of taking the old city hall, which was the police department originally as well, and into affordable housing. Mm-hmm. Some people say, well, that's not a good thing that we want in the front end of Bainbridge Island. Well, why not? Well, because. So that kind of thinking, you have to have the financial capacity from some sources to buy in the market, because there aren't very many people who will sell their property at less than market. And on Bainbridge Island, it's very, very difficult to do.
You're absolutely right, Ed. And you know, one thing I will say is, I know Blair King is pretty interested in using some of the city properties for affordable housing. We've been talking to him from the senior center about our expansion plans and thinking maybe what we can do is have affordable housing, senior housing adjacent to the senior center rebuild, which would be awesome. He's definitely got the heart for it. And you're right, like, who has the land? Well, Parks has a lot of land, and the city actually owns quite a few parcels too. So that's a very excellent point.
And the school district. Yes. The school district has lots of land that's not being used, at least from my point of view, to its fullest extent. If we have a shortage of space for teachers, why couldn't we school system build apartments and rent them to teachers?
And that's what they've done in other cities.
Yeah. I mean, these are not hard ideas to come to. It's the implementation of them. Putting city money on the table to buy land or develop land is the only way we're going to get there. Otherwise, we'll have all the rules, but none of the places to put it.
Got a great point. Exactly.
I don't want to, HRB is in the very early stages of talking about this, so I can't guarantee what the result will be. But I know that internally, we are really trying to put as much of our limited capacity towards doing some really cool, smart mapping of land that's available on Bainbridge, and getting really specific about even our internal kind of long range internal HRB planning. Like, if this land comes available, what could we put there? What would make sense? So that, Ed, is such a good point, and always on our minds internally at HRB. And before I forget, I wanted to share, this is not like the coolest thing in terms of what it sounds like. It doesn't usually catch people's ears, but HRB has started a conversation with the city. So for those of you who watch meetings, you might hear this come up in the near future. There's amazing funding through the State Department of Commerce called CHIP. We have a couple different CHIP programs in Washington, so I will be clear. This one means Connecting Housing to Infrastructure program. And the state ledge put $55 million in a pot and said, cities, apply for this money so that you can waive fees or help subsidize things like system improvement, like sewer system improvement that costs millions of dollars, like you're talking about, Ed, or bringing wet utilities from the street onto a property, or even utility connections, which are a little cheaper than those two things, but still very expensive. Bainbridge is an eligible entity for this funding. They just need to pass one ordinance to make it possible to receive the funding. It's one of those like funky bureaucratic things that's actually quite easy. So it's one of the things we just talked about with Blair King week before last. So pretty soon here, I'm hoping that City Council will receive a first draft of an ordinance that would make them totally eligible for CHIP. And, you know, certainly that would benefit HRB. We have to bring our wet utilities from the street to Erickson, and it's going to cost $500,000. And this could cover the whole thing, which is amazing. And the city can be a partner in that. But then, you know, also the city, if they, you know, pursue developing their own affordable housing, or, you know, do some sort of whatever they're going to do with their land in the future, they can also apply for this funding. So it would be a really smart move for the city, and it would help offset some of that infrastructure cost, which doesn't solve all the problems of infrastructure on Bainbridge Island for sure, but it can help fund some of those improvements.
Oh, that's exciting too, because that's a good pot, a new pot to draw on. Because one of the things that happens is you get kind of purse fatigue if we keep going to the same people on the same sources over and over and over. So looking for new options is really, really helpful. Jake, I wanted to say, you had something, didn't you?
Well, I just, first of all, everything, just listening to Maggie, now you know why we love HRB so much, because they think of everything. All these minds are looking for every nook and cranny. But when you're talking about getting purse fatigue, one of the things that I don't think many people realize is how much help the individual can be that isn't about donor dollars. One of the most critical things that we've found is that being on that list. So when there's an alert and there's a council meeting, there's a commission meeting, and being on that hot list and be able to write the timely letter, sometimes just a sentence, sometimes just a paragraph, but being that voice. You don't have to be in the room, but those, Maggie, is that not true? Those numbers of letters and the voice from the community has been essential in moving these things along, and it doesn't cost you a penny.
Mm-hmm.
Donor dollars are great. I mean, that's always a good thing, but realizing that your voice can be as important, and it's something that I think everybody needs to share. You know, tell your friends. You can, if this is important to you, because we know we talk to people about it. They are big proponents of affordable housing. They're interested in creating more diversity and equity on the island. And I just can't think of an organization that's doing better work around that than HRB. And anyway, that's all.
Yeah. Well,
Jake.
Gosh, I'm trying to get better at accepting compliments on behalf of HRB. And you're so right. I mean, yeah, of course, people, we value donor dollars and they keep us going, but so do civic voices. Like, we're just one part, and could literally, the accomplishments that have been undertaken would not have happened without people writing their city council. So thank you. It sounds like you've done that for us. So thank you. And for yourself and for your residents, like your neighbors. So thank you.
Maybe that's right. That might be a good note for us to leave people with, is that here's a really easy way to be helpful, and a really easy way to stay in touch with what's going on is go to that website for HRB and click on the link, and then you will be in touch, and you'll be able to find ways to make your voice heard. And nothing's more important than that. So thanks, everybody. Maggie, thank you so much. You're so articulate. That was wonderful. I really appreciate your very thoughtful, researched answers to my ridiculous off-the-cuff questions. But yeah, this is such a rich topic. I think we'll have to come back and have more in-depth looking at some of this other stuff as we go along. Again, thank you so much.